Loving as Christ loved. We are to imitate Jesus in the way he related to people who were selfish, prejudiced, judgmental, hateful, and vengeful. Here's Gene.
It's interesting that here in this message that Jesus was delivering to these 12 men and to those who were able to listen in, he was delivering a message that related to the perversion of the justice system by the religious leaders. Again, he's going to be speaking to the religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, at least contrasting their behavior with the behavior that he wanted his followers to have. And so we read about this in Matthew 5:38 and 39. And he says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Where did they get that information? That information came from the Pharisees, the religious leaders. "But I tell you," Jesus said, in contrast, "I tell you, don't resist an evildoer. On the contrary, if anyone slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also." Now, basically, that was somewhat of a way of spitting in somebody's face, is slapping them upside the face. And Jesus was saying, if somebody spits in your face, don't spit back. Turn the other cheek, as it were. A strong teaching. Notice what he said about loving your enemies. "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." The interesting thing is that statement never appears in the Old Testament, to hate your enemy. "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven." And then he explains, "For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good." In other words, God is gracious towards all people, even those who are evil. The sun shines, the rain falls. "For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Now, what happened is that the religious leaders actually modified the teachings of God and the law in order to allow people to take the law into their own hands and to retaliate and to take vengeance. And you can imagine what that actually created. And so Jesus is contrasting here, but also for our benefit, if you go back to the Old Testament, notice what we read in the Old Testament law. You see, the scribes and the Pharisees had set parameters for love. But God said this, even in the Old Testament, "If you see your brother's ox or sheep straying, you must not ignore it. Make sure you return it to your brother." Now there he's talking about religious relationships. "Do the same for the donkey, his garment, or anything your brother has lost and you have found. You must not ignore it." That's how you're to treat your brother. Now, the religious leaders might come along and say, "Yeah, but not your enemy." Well, notice what God said in the law. He said, if you come across your enemy's stray ox or donkey, you must return it to him, your enemy. If you see the donkey as someone who hates you, lying helpless under its load, and you want to refrain from helping it, you must help with it. That's even in the Old Testament. And so the religious leaders were coming along, setting their own parameters for love, and actually saying you have freedom to take vengeance, to take the law into your own hand. And Jesus is saying, I don't want you men to be that kind of men. You're going to be hated by the Romans. You're going to be hated by the religious Pharisees. But don't retaliate and take vengeance into your own hands. And Jesus, of course, set the standard here in an amazing way when he said this, when he was on the cross, when he looked down at those who had nailed him there. He said, Father, forgive them, because they do not know what they're doing. Jesus set the highest example in terms of loving your enemies. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And Jesus, of course, demonstrated that in a very specific way from the cross. We have Stephen's example, and this always amazes me. This is unbelievable. He's being stoned by the religious leaders. And by the way, Saul, who became the great apostle Paul, was approving of this stoning. And we read what happened. These are the religious leaders that is doing this. And notice what Stephen did. He knelt down and cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not charge them with this sin." He's not being judgmental, even when they're putting him to death. When I read that, it's overwhelming in terms of trying to identify with that kind of behavior if I were in a similar situation. We've actually seen some Christians who've demonstrated that even today among those who hate Christianity through beheadings and other horrible situations. So Jesus set a very high standard here. And later Paul spoke to the same issue when he wrote to the Romans. He said, "If possible on your part, live at peace with everyone, even your enemies," is the implication. "Friends, do not avenge yourselves. Instead, leave room for his wrath, for God's wrath. For it is written, 'Vengeance belongs to me. I will repay,' says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him." That takes grace, doesn't it? If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For in so doing, you'll be heaping fiery coals on his head. God will judge him, but you be gracious. And do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good. And that's the ultimate in love. And that's what Jesus was actually teaching his disciples, the apostles there in the upper room, when he washed their feet. And with that act of service was actually demonstrating what John later wrote in 1 John 3:16. He wrote this about 60 years later when he, probably in his 90s, reflecting back on that event, and he says, "This is how we know what love is." Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for others, for our brothers. So we have here an incredible indictment, again, on the religious leaders. And in contrast, Jesus is saying to these men, he's preparing for ministry, don't take vengeance. You are going to face persecution. Now, Jesus wasn't saying don't protect yourself, if that's possible. But he says don't take vengeance in relationship to your enemy. Now, here's a question, of course, that comes up in relationship to this. How can we as Christians practice this principle of love without allowing dishonest and selfish people, both within the church and in the world, to abuse and misuse our graciousness or even to commit criminal acts against us? So we've got to think in terms of how do we work that all out in relationship to Jesus' teaching. Well, within the church, Jesus established a very important process for those who are evil, those who take advantage of us. And he simply says this: if your brother sins against you, go and rebuke him in private if he sins against you. In other words, this is a very personal situation. If he listens to you, you've won your brother. But if he won't listen, take one or two more with you so that by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be established. In other words, there are other witnesses that know that this is a serious offense and it's wrong. And they know it's wrong, and so they go too. They're convinced of it. They're witnesses to this evil that has been done to you, or this offense, whatever it is. And then Jesus said if he pays no attention to them, that is, the smaller group who confront that individual with his sin, tell the church. And there the word is ecclesia, which really refers probably in that setting to the Sanhedrin. Take it to the religious body. And I think there's a very important principle there. Jesus is not saying if you take 2 or 3 and they don't listen, then take it to the whole church as we know it today. He's saying take it probably to the religious leaders, to the elders, to the group that have authority to help you to resolve that issue. But if he doesn't pay attention even to the church or those in authority, let him be like an unbeliever and a tax collector to you. In other words, you have no relationship with that individual, but at the same time, if you follow through, still love him. He may be your enemy, but still love him. Don't let him take advantage of you. Don't relate to him. Separate yourself from that particular situation and trust God to deal with it ultimately. There's another passage that deals with that within the church, and that is, brothers, if someone is caught in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual should restore such a person with a gentle spirit. In other words, here is a very obvious public sin. Paul's not saying go one-on-one. He's simply saying take spiritual people with you. People are walking in the Spirit. See, to deal with sin is not a task for people who are not living according to the Spirit of God. Watching out for yourselves so you also won't be tempted. Carry one another's burdens. In this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. So we have some direct teaching in how to handle people who try to take advantage of us, sin against us, and do those things which they shouldn't do. Now, we live in a world that is ruled by those who don't even follow Jesus, like the Roman Empire. How are they to deal with that? Well, Paul wrote to the Romans and he says, for government is God's servant for your good. Now, he's not saying that Nero had a servant's heart. What he is saying is, God has established governments as a servant to the people so there's not chaos in this world. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason. In other words, God has given governments the authority to deal with criminal activity. For government is God's servant. This is not our responsibility or individual responsibility or the church's responsibility other than to confront the sin. But when it becomes a sin against people, such as abuse and murder and stealing and all those things, Paul is saying you've got to trust the government, an avenger that brings wrath on the one who does wrong. So here we live in an imperfect world. As we become members of a loving Christian body, that gets as close to heaven as you can get, but even then it's far removed. But the wonderful thing is, if we love each other as Christ loves us, we have this community of trust and protection. But beyond that is the world. And when people violate the laws, the government has to deal with that. And righteously so, because God wills it. I had the privilege, as some of you know, of going into the prisons to present copies of my Bible. Most recently, I had that opportunity to present my Life Essential Study Bible to a group of women who had finished a one-year program. They're all believers. But among those 28 women, probably 90% of them are in for life. They've committed murder. But I sat with those women and I taught them how to use the Life Essential Study Bible. I saw their love for Christ. I saw their love for one another. A year ago, before that, I presented Bibles to 11 women who became mentors to these 28 women. And I asked the warden, who's a Christian, I said, how many of these women are in for life? She said 10 out of 11. And yet they're mentors. That's their family. But they are there because of the law, because of government that is dealing with their crime against humanity. The same was true in the men's prison where I gave Bibles to about 130 men. Most of them are lifers because of murder and rape. But their lives are being transformed by God and the Spirit of God. They're there because of what Paul said in Romans 13. And if it weren't for government, even though government can be very, very inappropriate and act inappropriately, still we have to recognize that we would be in absolute total chaos if governments were not established to maintain a semblance of order as far as this world is concerned. But see, the principle relates back to those of us who are believers relating to our brothers and sisters as well as the world itself. And the principle is we're to imitate Jesus in the way he related to people who were selfish, prejudiced, judgmental, hateful, and vengeful. And that's a great challenge. And it can only be accomplished through God's Spirit and God's wisdom that comes to us through other members of the body of Jesus Christ.